Good evening. Welcome all to the first activity of the exhibition Food, the Utopia of Proximity, in català, Food, la Utopia de la Proximitat. First, I want to introduce the participants of the conversation and introduce myself. I am Carol Goodden, director of Bolid Art Center, where last Saturday the exhibition Food, the Utopia of Proximity was opened. This exhibition is based in the significant Harold Berg's collection with artworks by Carol Goodden and Gordon Matta-Clark. Also in this exhibition, there are included a selection of Catalan artists that were involved in art in the 70s, as well as some younger artists of our territory. So we are involved in the present activity to the most important people related to this exhibition. First of all, Carol Goodden. He is an artist, and in this case, important not only as author of some of the artworks exhibit, also because Carol Goodden was involved in the history of food, and moreover, she is the cause of the link between the restaurant food and our region, Catalonia. Also, there are present in this connection to collaborate in the activity Eudal Camps. He is curator of the exhibition, like is Harold Berg and myself. I want also add that there are present in this connection some Catalan artists, participants in the exhibition. Hello to all of you. Secondly, I want to express my gratitude to Carol Goodden to participate today and for helping us during all the process to elaborate the exhibition project and the catalog that we are producing. Thank you very much indeed. Therefore, many thanks to Harold and Eudal for their excellent work in the exhibition. And finally, thank you to all the other artists and to the audience to be connected. Lastly, I want to introduce a little our center, especially to the possible foreigners connected. Bolid, Centre d'Art Contemporani Girona, is a small center created in 2008, located in the city of Girona, in the region of Catalonia, Spain. The Contemporaria Center is based in the Old Quarter in 3 separated spaces. One of them is a 19th century chapel called San Nicolau. At this moment, Harold Berg and I myself, we were connected with all of you in the Bolid's headquarters, where the exhibition shows the Harold Berg collection and other artwork by Catalan artists related with the subject of the exhibition, like Miralda Montadas, Pere Noguera, and Angel Ribé. Well, at this point, I want to give the floor to the collector and curator, Harold Berg, and thanks for this this work and conversation. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you very much, Karma. I would like to first thank Bolid for putting this exhibition together, particularly in blending what was happening abroad to what was happening here in Catalonia or by Catalan artists in other parts of the world, France and the US mainly. And probably, as you mentioned in your introduction, Karma, Carol Goodden lived here in Spain for a few years. And that would be probably the first question that I would like to ask Carol. How did you end up in the city of Mont-ras in Girona in 1962 or 63?
Actually, it was 1964, so a little bit later. And I was, let me see, how do I start this very long story? It was my father was English, and I had not seen my father since I was basically 5 years old. When I was transported to America. And I decided when I was in my early 20s that I wanted to find my father again. And so I contacted him and then took a ship and sailed over to France and then across Le Havre to across the channel and met my father. And it turned out that he had built a house in Montrose. And so I had been living with them for a couple of months and intended to probably never leave because I loved my father suddenly. And he invited me to come with himself and his family of 4 children, his wife and 4 children, my new brothers and sisters, to Montrose. And when I was there, I received a letter from a couple of American friends who said that they were traveling to Granada and would I like to meet them in Granada. And so the story goes on from there, but that's how I got to Montrose.
What are some of your memories of living in Catalonia and Spain at that time? What things do you remember of your years here?
Oh, in Catalonia, studying the language, I had to suddenly learn Spanish, and I spent every night writing down verbs, conjugating verbs and nouns, and forcing the language upon myself, so that when we went shopping, which to me was an extraordinary experience, live outdoor markets and all the piles of food in the fish market, and that was completely different than anything that happened in America, in the West, in my life. And the wonderful bread that they made in Spain and Catalonia, and the fact that you could just go out every day and buy what you needed. The narrowness of the streets, you had to squash yourself against the side of a building while a car went by, and there was only room in the street for that one car, and your body squashed up against a building, and everybody would step off out of the roadway and squash themselves against buildings as the car went by. That to me was unique. Watching people packing their donkeys and carrying things on their heads as they walked several miles on dirt roads. In Montrose at that time, everybody threw their garbage out the window. There was no garbage collection, and actually my father's wife organized with the mayor, the alcalde there in Montrose, to start a garbage collection with a horse-drawn cart and people putting the garbage in the horse-drawn cart. And walking along the Costa Brava, going down to the sea. There's so many things. I could probably go on forever. I will stop.
And then you went back to the United States, to New York in particular. And how come you got connected with the arts world?
My father was very connected to the art world in England and through the Royal College of Arts in London, and was manager in the Tate Gallery. And so I had gotten to know a great many artists that way, sculptors and painters in London. So it had awakened in me an interest, more of an interest than I already had. I lived in Spain, in Madrid, mostly for 4 years. And after that, I hitchhiked my way to London and caught the plane to America and I landed in New York City. I had $10 in my pocket.
Yes, yeah.
Has everybody disappeared? My screen went.
No.
Okay. And I automatically gravitated to Greenwich Village because the streets were small, the buildings were small. I didn't want anything to do with...
Connecta't perquè veuràs la Carol.
A ver. ¿Qué pasa?
No, somebody's connecting to the conference.
Oh, okay. Anyway, so I went in Lower Manhattan and met a lot of folk musicians there. And how did I get, let me think. Oh, I know how it was. So I met this very funny man in Washington Square who had a camera, and he was hunting for his daughter. So he would come up to every young woman, and he amused me and interested me when we began to talk. And in the process of talking, we decided we should have an art class, and we should invite people to draw. And so we put this ad in the Village Voice about a drawing class of models, nude models. And Richard Nonis came to the art class. And Richard and I got to talking, and from Richard, he said, oh, you have to meet this person and Mark DeSuvero, and I'll introduce you to the whole Soho world and everything that's going on. And we got a loft together, and that's how it began. And shortly after that, I met Gordon, and of course, then the rest is history.
And how did you meet Gordon?
112 Green Street. Let's see. Richard and I had broken up, and there was Jeffrey Liu was somebody who had moved into the area, and Jeffrey he and Rachel had bought an entire building, which was 6 floors. Jeffrey thought that he was going to be able to rent out the floors to artists, which he did, but he wanted a business in the lower floor, which is what it was supposed to be occupied as, and he couldn't find anybody because the businesses in Soho were vacating. And so he went around to the various artists and said to them, I want to start a gallery. And so one of the first shows that were started in the gallery meant artists could do anything they wanted to do. And Gordon was one of the people who was making holes in the floor and creating sculptures. And I went to the show, and that's how I met Gordon, and we started talking, and we just sort of never quit.
And then how did the idea of the food restaurants come about?
Oh, because in the days of Soho, it was a great big family. Whenever you had a party or a performance, sort of everybody came, and everybody was about 60 people. And when I was in the loft with Richard, I had been doing a lot of cooking because when I was in Spain, I got interested in cooking. And I got this great big Garland stove and was practicing cooking and inviting people over. So when we split up and I was in my other loft, Gordon came to this party that I threw, which was a food party, meaning everybody was supposed to come it had a theme of flowers. You either dressed as a flower, or you brought edible flowers, or you cooked something that looked like a flower or something to do with flowers. And I did a lot of cooking for that party, and 60 people came, and we had a great, great time. And Gordon said at the end of this party, which he never left, that I should start a restaurant. And I thought, because I was being a photographer at the time, and I had a 3-room dark room, and I was tired of working indoors in the dark during the day. And I thought, this is just exactly, I want to finish this photography business, and cooking is, I can have a lot of fun with that idea. So I said, I will, if you'll do it with me. And he said, okay. And so we started.
And at the beginning, what was your first efforts? Maybe you want to comment a little bit about the photograph that you have behind.
Well, I'll get there, yes. The first thing I did, literally the next day, was walk around Soho, because that's where I wanted. If I couldn't have a place in Soho to have the restaurant, I didn't want to have it. So I walked around Soho, and there was a Comidas Criollas, a Puerto Rican restaurant on the corner of Prince and Worcester Street. And I went into them because I knew that the area was changing. I knew businesses were going, they were open for breakfast and lunch, and then they left. There was no place for dinner. And I went to them and said, would you be interested in me buying you out of your lease? They had 2 or 3 years left on the lease. And so we talked and we made a deal. And then I went to the landlords and I said, I'm not interested in 2 or 3 years. I want a 10-year lease. Will you give me that? And they did. So we had an arrangement. So now I had a space. And before I concluded the deal, I then said, well, I don't want to do this all by myself. This is a big project. And I checked with my family and inheritance, which I had just recently received, and said, can I do this? And he said, well, why don't you go get a job in a restaurant and learn something first? I said, nah, I just want to do this. So well, I went to Susie Harris and I went to Rachel Liu, and I said, will you do this with me? Because I knew that they were interested in food, and they agreed. And so I said, I want to change the menu every day. And we had this conversation about how it would be. So we agreed. So I signed the lease, and then we opened this restaurant. I took down the Comidas Criollas sign, and Tina, we were very connected with the Cajun group of artists down in Delancey Street area. And Tina was part of the work crew. And this photograph behind me is the first day when we went into the Comidas Criollas, and we were ripping out all their old tables and chairs and the kitchen equipment that was, we didn't want anything to do with. So that's my dog Glaza, who is an art dog. He was at every art performance and every art party, and there are many stories about Glaza, who is an Athabascan sled dog that came with Richard Nonis, actually, from the north. And there's Tina with her back to us. She was a hard worker, and she's helping clear everything out. And Gordon is walking towards me behind Glaza there. And Randall Araby is another Cajun artist who is part of the Philip Glass Ensemble. And he's working on straightening out the window or doing something with the window so it could make it work. And that window is a huge wide window that you could open up. And so when we had our guest chef days later on, which was one of Gordon's wonderful ideas, we asked Mark de Souvero if he would like to come and serve a dinner. And he had just received a Guggenheim grant. And he bought a crane with his Guggenheim grant because he had been injured on one of those elevator things, making his huge wood sculptures. So he decided he was going to serve his dinner through that window with the crane.
And did he manage to serve the full meal?
Actually, I think he got called off to Italy to solve Venice's sinking problem over there. He was an engineer and seemed to know how to do that, and actually did work on it. So he got called away before that actually happened. So.
And those chef nights that you were mentioning before, what did they consist of?
The guest chef nights were, we would invite an artist to cook a meal. And he could do whatever he wanted to do. And we said we would provide all the groceries. They were just to tell us what they wanted. And we would provide the dishwasher and the waitresses. So they could do whatever they wanted. Sachika Takahashi, who is Rauschenberg's right-hand man, was a beautiful painter and sculptor. And he made these beautiful Japanese dishes, which were literally paintings of colors of different shapes of food and colors. And the more famous guest chef meals were Gordon's, because he was such an original thinker. One of those guest chef meals, Gordon served live brine shrimp in hard-boiled eggs that we had cut in half and taken the yolk out, and these little brine shrimp were swimming inside the broth that we had put inside half of this egg. So there were people that were not artists that came to eat at food, and they would say, oh, they would get very upset and angry. What do you think? Yes, and we would say, we feed you whatever we want to feed you on Guest Chef Day. And I said, if you want to leave, you're welcome to leave. And they would, some of them. But Eliza Bear, I think, from Avalanche, you know, Eliza Bear would stare at these live little swimming shrimp, and she couldn't do it. But Jackie Windsor, she would just toss down the egg of the live brine shrimp and eat those. The other really, really famous dinner that I heard about years afterwards, even from people in Europe, was Gordon's Bone Dinner. We went around to the meat markets with my pickup truck, and we filled the pickup truck with bones and neck bones and huge bones and little bones. We got frogs bones and chicken bones. And anyway, we boiled these bones down, and we made a tomato aspic salad. We made the whole dinner had something to do with bones, an oxtail stew. And then it went into the main course, which was stuffed oxtail bones with wild rice and mushrooms and spices. And at the end of the dinner, Saskia Takahashi was in the back room with the dishwasher, which Richard Peck, who was another part of the Philip Glass ensemble. And Richard was scrubbing these bones up, and Saskia would drill holes through the sides of the bones and strung the bones on a rope, a hemp rope. And so the waitress would go to the table and hand the people the bill for the end of and hand them this rope bone necklace so they could wear their dinner home.
Fantastic.
It was
fantastic.
Crazy. Yeah.
And the response of the people or the customers that used to come to foods, what were their reactions?
They loved the wholesomeness of the food. They loved the fact that they could see everything being made. In the first year before the city didn't allow us anymore, we had piles of parsley and piles of fresh butter and baskets of homemade bread because we had these bakers from the Madbrook farm in Vermont that would come down and bake bread every night. So we kept changing the bread recipes, and there were people from Long Island that said they came all the way from Long Island just for our bread, because you couldn't really find it easily in New York, not in restaurants anyway. And they loved we had a lot of different kinds of food, and we changed the menu all the time, which they really liked. We didn't have a lot of choices, so sometimes that was problematical because maybe we had chicken and they'd already had chicken that day or something, but we had a variety of desserts of all kinds. We squeezed carrot juice and orange juice fresh right there, you know, which was a disaster from cleaning standpoint, but they really liked it. And they liked watching their salad. Barbara Lloyd, the dancer, would make salads right in front of them, and they were sculptures and paintings, and they loved watching all of that happen right in front of them. They loved the fact that the kitchen was out in the open. They hadn't seen that in New York before, and we were immediately copied by a lot of restaurants, that idea. So I don't know what else to say. I mean, it was very popular. There was Milton Glaser was one of the artists for the New Yorker magazine. And the first year that we were open, he came and he made this beautiful drawing of all the wacko chairs that we had. Every chair was completely different from the other chair. And they made this wonderful drawing, and there was an article in the New Yorker, and people kept saying, oh, please don't write about this restaurant. We'll be overwhelmed. And it's already, very busy. All the artists gravitated from Max's Kansas City, which was the hangout before, to food, and they could sit and talk and create their dances. And it was a social place as well as just an eating place. Anyway, that day, with the week that the New Yorker came out, there were two other magazines, the New York Times and some other one that came out at the same time. The people were lined up around 2 blocks waiting to get into food, so those kinds of things are difficult because you aren't prepared to have that sort of overwhelming response.
Yes. And the why was bread so important in your view?
Gosh, I think bread is a staple of any meal most times, but bread in America in restaurants seems to be an afterthought. It doesn't have the kind of nourishment and look and feel and chewiness that bread should have. I think I really brought that from Spain with me. That and a lot of fish dishes from Spain. But bread is just, it's part of the experience somehow, the feel of the bread and the crust and the sound of it. And I don't know what else to say.
And the migas, don't forget the migas.
Yes, well, I happen to like the migas, but they would teach me to take the migas out and just eat the crust. And they also, in Spain, learned to, you don't put it on your plate as a gentle side thing. No, it's a big thing. You take a hold of it with both hands and you twist it like this. And you put a chunk on the table, right on the table itself. And it's just part, I don't know, it's just an important part of the whole tradition of eating.
It's, as you said, it's part of the experience, and it's new and it's different, very, very different.
Yeah.
Eudald, do you want to ask something to Carol?
I don't know. I'm just listening. One moment, let me think about.
Perfecto, perfecto. And the being a female artist in the 70s, what was it like compared to today?
Oh, I can't really speak about today because I'm not really part of the art crowd of today. So I don't know. I and all the women working at the time were lucky in that it was also the women's movement. And so there was a general sociological movement towards accepting the woman as being something other than a housewife or taking care of children. And even though this started during the war, it by the 70s had grown. Women didn't have to hide their names when they were authoring a book, for instance. And Laurie Anderson was a musician out there and very innovative with her musical work. The Philip Glass Ensemble was totally male, but that was just who they were. Jackie Windsor was making massive sculptures with, rope that were bigger than the size of my arm in thickness, and very powerful statements. She was a tall woman, and I think that part of the essence of her was coming through in her sculptures. Patsy Norvell used to be the companion of David Smith, the sculptor, and she went out on her own and started doing her own sculptures. And she taught me, I would help her sometimes, and she taught me that a woman can do anything if you have the right tools. And she would prove to me that it only took the right tool to be able to build something complex or something massive, whether it was glass or metal or wood or whatever. So I was just observing women. Tina Gerard was as active and important in the art community as any of the men at the time of minimalism and in the 70s. So it was an evolving time. The women didn't seem to get names as big as Rauschenberg and Rosenquist and the men working who actually came slightly before. When you think the pop era seemed to be more, not in totally, but more about men, but gradually more and more women during the 70s.
Vale, apagues això.
Now, what is interesting is that a lot of the galleries that were presenting younger artists, a lot of them were run by women. Paula Cooper,
Holly Solomon.
Holly Solomon, exactly. Leo Castelli's wife, Ileana Sonnabend, and they were all ladies. They were all ladies, and they were pushing the very new stuff.
Yes, yes, that's right. They were. They were able to see and promote, get excited by the very avant-garde thinking of the artists of the 70s.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. Very big difference. Over the years, I'm sure lots of people have been asking you about the food years, and what is the question that you're mostly asked around food over the last 40 years?
I think the biggest question that I am asked in these later years is, what was it? Why did it become famous? What was it about it that makes it continue to have shows and people interested and articles about it? I think that's the question that's almost the hardest to answer. They want to know what the physical setup was, and interested in the fact that we had a blackboard that we would just wipe away every day and put the new menu up. When there was a show on Rikers Island, Cecilia Alemany recreated food. She made the physical reference. She was very interested in the fact that we had wood tables that we scrubbed down with sawdust every night. Everything was very different about food than most restaurants, and the fact that we had these huge pots of soups, and she recreated 2 of the soups, asked for recipes and had people there, and even bread. She managed to get a really good bakery to sort of duplicate the bread that we were making, and then she had almost in a French cafe way of long tables and everybody sitting. Wasn't exactly the same, but it had the ambience, it had the feeling of food. And she had a blackboard even that she put up. So,
Eudals?
Yes, one question. Carol, I listened to you explaining the food experience, and I'm not speaking about a pandemic. Now we are in a pandemic time, no? In a pandemic situation. But imagine that all was normal. Do you think an experience like food would be possible today with actual conditions? I don't know.
you mean with a pandemic?
No, without pandemic. Just today.
Oh, well,
or was it, the situation in the 70s was very, very special. Do you think that today will be possible?
No, I quite agree with what you're thinking, that it had its moment in time then, and it was successful then because it was original then. But food started a type of restaurant in the United States that grew in New York and then went to San Francisco and then started all over. I mean, it's even in Albuquerque, I see these kinds of restaurants now. So the idea that we created started very quickly, and everybody has very much improved. I mean, what we were doing in comparison to some of the foods that are being promoted these days, the Pacific Rim, incredible designs of foods on plates, we would be outclassed. You know, we would be in the peasant variety, which was fabulous at the time and perfect for Soho. But I don't know how you know, we would have to go to some island somewhere and start again.
Great.
And could that be, in a way, explained also by the level of collaboration that you had in the 70s, which nowadays it's probably more difficult?
Yes, I don't know how that would work today, but certainly in the 70s, there was a cooperative attitude. I think even artists are more private nowadays, but in the 70s in Soho, the interesting thing is that the 70s in Soho duplicated what was going on in France during the time of the Impressionists, because that was a family of people, and they were sharing ideas, and they were innovative ideas, and it was a major step out of realism into Cubism and Fauvism and all of those art movements at the time, including dance. You look at Isadora Duncan starting to get out of formal ballet and do something entirely different with the Art Nouveau attitudes. And that family feeling, the interaction, the sharing and excitement of new ideas and working them out all together existed again in the 70s. And those are the only two times that I know of that French family group and the 70s group. And those people, it was a time of communes. People were getting out of the city and living in communes together. I don't know whether communes even exist anymore. It came out of the hippie era, really. The hippie era had people all together, living together, mutual sex everywhere. And I think that communal attitude got a little more civilized by the 70s. And that's what helped that cooperative effort, which may not exist anymore.
Yeah, yeah. It's very different, very, very different. Karma, do you want to ask something to Carol?
Yes, I want. Thank you.
Yes.
Two things.
Claro.
First, I want to ask Carol, what do you remind about 112 Green Street, where you organized the performance Raindrop Dance, and where sometime after the artist Francesc Torres and Àngel Ribé, here present in the connection, exposed? What do you remind about this space?
112 Green Street was, first of all, a physically interesting space in that it had a very wide, I believe it was at least 30 feet, which for those buildings was a wide space from side to side, and it was 90 feet long, and the ceilings were 18 feet high. So you had this enormous box, rectangle box, and wood floors, old wood floors. So there was nothing in the way of your visual experience, and you could create anything in it. And in particular, Jeffrey Liu was magnanimous in saying to the artists, do anything you want, just whatever it is that you do, put it back the way it was. So Gordon cut a hole in the floor so that he could make a sculpture in the basement which could be seen from up above, which was a totally different kind of perspective. And he did a lot of interesting. George Tracus did the same kind of work through multi-levels, and it was a freedom that wasn't allowed the artists before in pristine, painted, glossy floor spaces. So that's the biggest thing that I remember, was the freedom that the space itself allowed and that Jeffrey allowed. So you wanted me to talk about the raindrop dance also?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
So I was asked to put together a series of dancer performances. And one of the, not just my raindrop dance, but one of the dance performances that I remember that I completely loved was Sue Wilde's performance. And she was the original wife of Bob Rauschenberg, as many may know, and then Bernie Kirschenbaum. But Sue Wilde made this, she had clothing that she had planted with grass seed and watered for a couple of months before the actual performance. So her dancers came in wearing grass clothing. They had a grass shirt, grass skirt, grass ties, grass hat. And it was all covered in living live grass, which they had mowed with scissors. So that was a wonderful dance, I thought. And the raindrop dance, I had this idea from watching raindrops falling from the edges of roofs, that there was a pattern, an irregular pattern of how the rain fell onto the ground. Not a heavy rain, but just sort of when rain has ended, there's that staccato pattern. And I thought it would be interesting to see dancers dripping from a bar high above the floor in the same way. And so I asked Gordon to rig me up a pole, a long, heavy metal pole from the ceiling, which was 18 feet high, in 112 Green Street. And so the dancers had ladders, and they climbed up the ladders, and then they shimmied out onto the pole till they got to, the center, and then they stopped, and then they hung there. And the idea was that they were to hang as long as their strength allowed them to hang. There was no rule. And when they could no longer hang, they were to let go and drop to the floor. And so they did. Sometimes it was one, then a little wait, and then there was another, and then maybe two would drop at the same time or almost at the same time. So it absolutely did make this staccato rhythm of rain falling as the dancers dropped to the ground. Unfortunately, the ceiling didn't hold. And so halfway through the dance, not only did the dancers fall down, but so did the bar and the chains and the plaster. And everything came crashing down into the middle of this mess. It was like a huge pile of snow come falling off of a roof onto the ground. Anyway, that was the raindrop dance.
The second question is about this piece. Also, we want to promote a re-edition of this piece here, 50 years after.
Okay.
And I
It's anchored the ceiling really well.
Yeah, it will be in May probably. And I want to ask you, what do you recommend to the actors, to the professionals that, the dancers, to do this work? Maybe, Carol, maybe it will be in the street. Yes.
How would you hang the bar from the street? What would you use?
To buildings.
Uh-huh.
In front of the art center.
Okay, well, I would, for the safety dancers, I would make sure that you have a padding, so when they fall, they have something not concrete to land on. And otherwise, as long as they dress in something that can stretch easily because their hands are way over their heads and that they can fall in, and shoes that are not going to hurt their feet when they fall, you want to have somebody holding the ladders, because the ladders have to be fairly tall to get the top high enough off the ground, because it has to be high enough off the ground to make an impression, right? So otherwise, there's no preparation that they really need to do. They just have to be able to shimmy out onto that pole, have the strength to do that. If they're strong enough to shimmy out onto the pole and hang there for, at least 60 seconds or so.
Okay, thank you. And can I do my third question?
Por supuesto.
I want to ask Carol about the picture of Richard Nonas in Cadaqués, where I can recognize the Saint Sebastian Chapel in the top of the hill.
Oh, yes.
Do you tell us which situation did you take this picture, please?
Oh, well, you know, as I say in the beginning, I was dating Richard Nonas, and I decided to introduce him to my family. And so we met in Montrose, and then we took a walk through the hills. And is that Cadaqués? Is that picture in Cadaqués?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, well, so my family was connected to Barbara, and I can't remember Barbara's last name, who was married to an artist and she lived in Cadaqués right next to Dali. And so we were taken there to meet Dali and have lunch with Barbara, and then we took a walk in the hills. And Cadaqués was wonderful. I loved watching them pound octopus on the side, you know, to soften the octopus on the piers there. That was interesting to me to see.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Se acuerda mucho Carol de cómo golpeaban el pulpo en la playa. ¿Eh? You had a couple of other photographs that you wanted to share with us.
Just a minute, I don't know that. Let's see if I can get myself out of the way here. And Beverly is going to switch these photographs for us.
Yes.
So that's what food looked like when we were ready to open the doors at noon. Everything was orderly because in the morning preparation, all those tables were covered with fruits and vegetables and, you know, people making desserts, and it was literally used as the workspace because the kitchen was out in the open. So we would clean it up just before the people arrived. I remember having a dream once talking about bread. I remember having this dream at 12 o'clock. You see, these people would line up at the door, and there was this tremendous pressure that everything had to be ready on time. And in my dream, all these people had come from Long Island for our bread, and we didn't have the bread ready because the bread maker had been sick that night. And they came into the restaurant, and we had one piece of bread, one long stick of bread left over from the night before. And this woman was very angry, and she started beating me with the bread and saying, "I want this bread, I want this bread." It's just a crazy dream. Oh dear. So next picture. And that's, whoops. And that's more, am I in the way? Let me get out of the way totally. No, camera's there. So that's the picture of the big pots on the stove. They were really huge. We found those on the Bowery. They were copper pots, and we had them retinned. And that stove in front of the low stove that the pots are sitting on is the stove that Gordon designed for. And there were three burners. It was taken after a Japanese way of cooking foods. And Tina is there in a plaid shirt doing something. I can't quite see what she's doing. Robert Prado, who is the main saxophonist in the Philip Glass Ensemble, is there at the main stove, the big stove, with his hand outstretched there, working with some kind of food. And next to him is Suzanne Harris, who was an artist in her own right. And both of those two died very young. That's quite sad, in totally different situations. And Susie is cutting cheese, getting that part ready. Anyway, so
Fantastic, fantastic. And Susie died the same year that Gordon died, didn't she? 78.
I was thinking it was a little earlier. Was it not the year before? I don't remember clearly. If you must know, I didn't really keep track of that.
Because you were very close to her, weren't you?
I was. And she was Gordon's soulmate, I have to say. I mean, they were very, very connected in their ideas of alchemy. Susan was very interested in dyes and alchemy and transforming gold and what have you. And they were both always stirring pots, big pots of whatever. And Gordon was too. So they were quite connected on that level. Susie had enormous energy, as did Gordon. And they were both innovative dancers. Anyway, yes.
Great. Eudald, Karma. Anything we want to ask Carol?
Yes, I want to ask about the economy. The question is about the economy of the artist economy in New York. The installations feature another artworks like the artworks presented in 112 had the opportunity to be sold.
Well, part of the idea that was operating at the time was the fact that there was an anger at artists doing work, collectors coming along and buying the work, and then those works appreciating millionfold over what the artist had received. And so part of the not the minimalist idea, but the conceptualist period of time was that art was an intellectual process rather, or could be an intellectual process rather than a physical process. And so if they were not making something physical, it couldn't be bought, but it was still art. People were poor, certainly. Some of the artists, had enough money to live on anyway. So the idea of working intellectually wasn't about selling. So the dancers couldn't really sell their pieces. Later on, be paid for performances, and were able to pay their performers, but before that, it was simply about intellectual activity. I think when Trisha Brown started and asked John Cage to do the music for her piece and Rauschenberg to design the costumes for her piece, nobody was paid. It was just fun. They were working. One of the big statements that was made at the Whitney Museum when the Uptown Whitney first started was an artist, and I'm sorry I don't remember his name, that his piece was like an artwork, an earthwork. It was a huge block of ice. The block of ice was maybe 4 feet by 8 feet, a really giant block of ice. And he had covered the ice block, which was in front of the Whitney as you walked in, with leaves, fall leaves, maple leaves and so forth. So there was this little bit of color on top of the ice, kind of stuck just because the ice was wet. And it was fall, so it wasn't really cold, and the ice began to melt. So the art was, just like Trisha's dances, the art was the changing shape of the ice as it melted through the days, and the water pattern that was made, and the different motion of the leaves on top of the ice until it was finally gone. You can't buy it, but it was a great work of art.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And one question. And Carol, do you plan to publish your memories someday?
Oh, no.
I've read a little bit of them, and I like a lot. It's wonderful, a wonderful text.
Well, thank you. I have just allowed one of my local friends here who is rather sophisticated in his understanding of literature and so forth, and he's been extremely complimentary. And there have been people through I wrote the whole memoir in like 2002, and people have been very, very complimentary about the writing style and the information. I feel like it needs some editing, and I'm not sure that I have the capability of editing, number one, because it seems to me there are very disparate parts, and I'm not sure that you have read some of the earlier parts versus the later parts. But my uncle, Frank, was very connected in literature and I used to date somebody who owned E.P. Dutton. And anyway, as my uncle was connected, I said 2 years ago, you know, people are really complimentary about this. Perhaps I might try to see if anybody would be interested in publishing with some editing, of course. So my uncle, I think, didn't really think it would make the grade, but he didn't want to tell me that. And so he told me that he had sent it to E.P. Dutton, who is his very close friend. And then he said, you know, he liked it a lot, but it just isn't for him to put the money out to publish, especially in this time of books, that the anti-feeling against books. And my uncle then died, and I went to the funeral, and Paula Cooper's husband, who's the E.P. Dutton, he didn't say a word. And I thought, you know, my uncle never sent it to him, because I thought surely he would have said something. So my thought is, you know, I'm not a big enough name. Gordon is a big enough name, but do I have all the details? And, you know, and then there are the other political problems that surround the issue of me and Gordon that make it complex. And so I'm just not sure. You know, I would love it if somebody would like to tackle it.
A lo mejor tenemos que hincarle el diente, Eudald.
Yo creo que sí.
Maybe you and me, because Eudald is an amazing writer.
Uh-huh.
Eudald is an amazing writer. Yes.
And you are a good friend.
No. I'm a very difficult friend. You know that.
Yeah.
Karma, how are we doing in terms of time?
Son las 7, it was 7. Yo quiero abrir, si alguien más quiere hacer alguna pregunta.
Por favor, sí.
De los presentes, que algunos ya han marchado, pero bueno.
Rodolfo, Isabel, Ana, Pedro.
Ana está. Oh, bien. Hola, Ana.
No question.
Bueno, perfecto.
I want to say, please, that I'm so impressed at what you have done there. I'm sorry that COVID doesn't allow me to be there, because I would love to be there to meet you all in person. And I think the pictures that I've seen of the show that you've put up look completely wonderful. And I would love to see, I guess you're going to produce a catalog so that I can see the other artists of the 70s from Spain that you mentioned are part of the show. I would really like that. And just, Harold, you're just amazing how you keep going, Mr. Energizer Bunny, with putting these shows on. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Carol, for joining us.
Well, thank you for asking me. It's been fun. Enjoyed it.
Big kiss from Girona.
Yes.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao, ciao.